Britain and the EU saying they have reached a deal on the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is hailing it as, quote, a great new deal. You see, he tweeted that out just a short while ago. He is urging the UK Parliament to approve this deal this week. Now, the deal lays out terms on sticking points, including border and customs issues between EU member Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK. But Boris Johnson's Northern Irish allies in Parliament, the DUP, say they do not plan to back the deal. All right, let's bring in our correspondent in London at the moment. Charlotte Potts is standing by for us. Hi, Charlotte. You know, this is news that has just come across in the last 20, 30 minutes that an agreement has been reached. What can you tell us? What are some of the reactions that you're seeing over there?
Well, white smoke coming from Downing Street. Boris Johnson confirmed that actually a deal has been finally reached with the European Union. He was tweeting earlier, we've got a great new deal that takes back control. Now Parliament should get Brexit done on Saturday. And this is the case. On Saturday, Super Saturday here in the UK, Parliament will sit for the first time in 40 years and will have to approve this deal if there is indeed a chance of the UK leaving the European Union on October 31st. And really, the impossible has been done. That is the reaction here in the UK. Nobody really counted on Boris Johnson being able to open that withdrawal agreement again. The European Union had always said, we are not going to go there. We are not going to open that withdrawal agreement again that had been negotiated under the former Prime Minister, under Theresa May, and had been rejected by Parliament 3 times. Now Boris Johnson has found a solution, apparently, was able to reopen it, make some tweaks, and a new deal has been reached. So quite astonished reactions here in the UK at the moment.
Astonished also, Charlotte, because it's really coming down to the last minute. You know, there's this huge summit with the European Union today where they were supposed to have a deal in hand. And up until this morning, the German chancellor here in Berlin was saying she didn't have a deal yet. The EU ambassadors arriving in Brussels, rather, also didn't have anything in their hands. And there were some sticking points, particularly with Boris Johnson's Northern Irish allies, the DUP. And they have still said they cannot support the plan that's on the table. So why exactly does Boris Johnson sound so confident with this deal?
That is a very good question, because indeed we've heard from the DUP again, from the Northern Irish allies, after the news came out that the deal had been reached, that they would not support it at this point, which means their votes are going to be missing in Parliament. It's 10 members of Parliament of the DUP that Boris Johnson desperately needs to get this deal through Parliament. And really for the DUP, this comes down to the very fundamentals of who they are. They want Northern Ireland to be as closely aligned to the United Kingdom as possible. They fear that over the long term, this deal could make Northern Ireland be closer aligned to Brussels and Dublin than to London. And this really is the sticking point for them and remains a sticking point. Now, is this a negotiating tactic from the DUP? Will they, in the end, after all, support a deal? Because that is, of course, better than a no-deal scenario where we would see a hard border returning on the island of Ireland between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. We just don't know if they can support it in the end. But at the moment, as things stand, the statement just came out from them saying we're still not supporting this current deal.
Charlotte, we've got to jump in there because Michel Barnier is just about to speak here, the EU chief negotiator. Let's listen into what he's saying.
Ladies and gentlemen, the UK government has wanted to open one point in the withdrawal agreement, a key point, the question of the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. Throughout these negotiations, the EU and the UK were fully committed to protect peace, to protect stability on the island of Ireland. We had to reconcile 2 objectives. First, include a legally operative solution in the withdrawal agreement that would avoid a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, preserve the whole island economy and protect the integrity of the single market. Secondly, a point extremely important to Prime Minister Johnson and the UK was that Northern Ireland remains in the UK's customs territory. Discussions over the past days have at times been difficult, but we have delivered, and we have delivered together. The solution that we found rests on four main elements. Number one, Northern Ireland will remain aligned to a limited set of EU rules, notably related to goods. This means that all applicable procedures on goods will take place at the points of entry into Northern Ireland and not across the island. For this purpose, UK authorities will be in charge of applying the Union's customs code in Northern Ireland. Number two, beyond applicable procedures, there is also the question of customs duties. Northern Ireland will remain in the UK's customs territory. It will therefore benefit from the UK's future trade policy. But Northern Ireland will also remain an entry point into our single market. So, what have we done to square this circle? UK authorities can apply UK tariffs on products coming from third country so long as those goods entering Northern Ireland are not at risk of entering our single market. However, for goods at risk of entering the single market, UK authorities will apply the EU's tariffs. Number three, this night and this morning also, we were working on the issue of VAT. It is an important subject to avoid distortion of competition within the single market for goods. On this point also, we have managed to achieve two objectives: maintain the integrity of the single market, but also satisfy the UK's legitimate wishes. And finally, number four, Prime Minister Johnson and the Taoiseach wanted to ensure long-term democratic support for the application by UK authorities of relevant Union rules in Northern Ireland. 4 years after the entry into force of the protocol, the elected representatives of Northern Ireland will be able to decide by simple majority whether to continue applying relevant Union rules in Northern Ireland or not. This democratic support is a cornerstone of our newly agreed approach. Why? Because this newly agreed protocol is no longer to be replaced by a subsequent agreement between the EU and the UK. So, it makes sense to ensure consent. Ladies and gentlemen, obviously, when discussing Northern Ireland, we talk about the economy, about technical matters, about goods. But let me say very frankly that for me, since day one, since 3 years, what really matters are the people of Northern Ireland and Ireland. What really matters is peace.
You've been listening to Michel Barnier there, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, confirming there is a draft withdrawal agreement with the UK on Brexit. He said this text should provide legal certainty in every area where Brexit, like any separation, creates uncertainty, even on the key point of how to solve the issue of avoiding a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. He said they've also laid the groundwork to open negotiations on a future free trade agreement. Now, let's break down all of what we just heard there. We have our correspondents on this story for us. DW's Georg Mattes in Brussels, Charlotte Potts in London. Good to see you both. Georg, we have to start with you where all the action is at the moment. You've been listening in there to Michel Barnier as well. What did you take away from what he said?
Sumi, who would have thought we finally hear those words? We have delivered together, and someone speaking of a dynamic compromise. I mean, after really weeks and months of negotiations, we're back where we have already been with Theresa May, only this time there's, I would say, a lot more optimism than you've heard Michel Barnier saying that he could imagine that Boris Johnson may well convince his parliament to support this deal. But believe you me, I mean, EU leaders will want to hear from Boris Johnson how exactly he is going to do that before they endorse this revised withdrawal agreement, as it's called now.
Georg, I'm going to task you with the difficult job of taking us through some of the points that were on the table just there from Michel Barnier, because, again, that key sticking point was what to do to avoid a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And he listed 4 points there. Can you describe what exactly the solution is that they have agreed upon?
I mean, he spoke of a dynamic compromise, and I see here compromises in what Michel Barnier has printed out for us or mapped out for us on both sides. Let's start with the UK and a key compromise being that the Northern Ireland will remain aligned to limited set of rules of the customs union and the internal market. That means on paper, Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, will remain part of the UK's custom territory, but effectively on the ground there will be checks. For instance, in the Irish Sea, Michel Barnier spoke of points of entry, and I can't see any other place than the Irish Sea, where there will be controls, where customs officers will adjust to the EU's customs system, and he made also clear that this is UK personnel. Here I can see a bit of an EU compromise. Then another place where we could talk about an EU compromise is the EU has for a long time said the backstop, so the guarantee that there will be no hard border, cannot have an expiry date. Well, now, every 4 years, the Parliament in Northern Ireland will have a say whether they do want to continue this de facto part of the customs, being part of the customs union of the EU. Every 4 years, a simple majority will decide, yes, we do want to keep that scenario or no. So in a sense, this is an expiry date coming in through the back door. But Michel Barnier is absolutely right to say that it is also democratic consent. So I think these are the key pillars, the key sticking points that remained on the table. Of course, there's also the VAT, where a solution has been found. He didn't go into greater detail here, but it looks like they have managed to find a way to organize a backstop. I haven't called it backstop anymore, so I would say it's a regulatory arrangement, let's call it that way, where the UK and the EU can live with. We'll have to see if the DUP gives the green light as well.
All right, that takes us to London. Charlotte, you're there following this for us as well. You know, we've heard a lot of optimism now in Brussels, but also from the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who tweeted out about the agreement a little earlier, saying this is a great new deal that takes back control. Tell us what you've been hearing there.
Well, obviously a very happy Boris Johnson here in London. He has reached the impossible, so to say. The European Union had said we are not going to open that withdrawal agreement again, and he accomplished that. He made them open it and revise it. I've just looked at the text, 64 pages there with the details that some of them Georg has just mentioned, and we've been hearing from Downing Street that this is the best deal for the UK and that the Prime Minister thinks that the members of Parliament should now rally behind it, because that is the next obstacle. The British Parliament on Saturday will be sitting for the first time on a weekend in 40 years, and members of Parliament will have to decide whether now, this time around, they will indeed rally behind this new deal. As Georg mentioned again, we've been here before. There was a withdrawal agreement that Theresa May brought into Parliament that was rejected 3 times. The numbers really haven't changed in parliament. They've even gotten worse. Boris Johnson has lost his Conservative majority. He does need the Northern Irish DUP on board. He does need substantial parts of his own party and maybe even of the opposition party to pass that withdrawal agreement. And so this is going to be the next big step here in London, that he now needs to rally the members of parliament behind this deal.
Charlotte, I do want to ask you about the DUP. This is Boris Johnson. The Northern Unionist Party is, this is Boris Johnson's. These are his Northern Irish allies, and they have actually propped up his Conservative government. And the DUP has said until now they are not going to support this deal that is on the table, and that doesn't seem to have changed. I mean, what are you hearing there?
Well, I think that Boris Johnson is trying to strong-arm the DUP in supporting this deal. Basically, what is happening is he says, look, I've gotten a new withdrawal agreement just for you. You were the issue last time around, and now we've made significant changes to the deal, so you have to get on board. Brussels is happy. We are happy. The Conservative Party is happy with it. So get your act together and finally support that deal. But for the DUP, of course, this is a very fundamental issue. They want to be as closely aligned as possible to London, to the United Kingdom, and not to Brussels and Dublin. And they will look very closely now at that legal text, at the 64 pages of documents that have just been coming out of the European Union. And then they will see if in the end they might finally be able to rally behind it. But for now, as things stand, they've just made another statement. They are not on board yet. So that is 10 votes less for Boris Johnson on Saturday in Parliament and for his deal.
And Charlotte, just to follow up on that, it appears that this question of a value-added tax regime really has been where the DUP has said it cannot get on board. Is that right?
Yeah, that was one of the issues, and a very big issue for Northern Ireland was the issue of consent. Now, as far as I've been reading this withdrawal agreement, they do get a say every 4 years on whether the status quo should continue or not. But they don't, or they won't get a veto in the first place on whether they are going to take part in this deal, and that remains a very big issue for them. The other details we will need to look at more closely and also see what the DUP is saying in the next few hours here. Another issue I want to raise, though, it is of course not only about the DUP in Parliament on Saturday, because as I mentioned, it's only 10 votes on their end, but it is also about Boris Johnson's own party, about the Conservative Tory party, because the hardliners have not supported the deal in the past, the Brexiteers. They have said this morning that they will look very closely at the legal text, that they do trust Boris Johnson more than Theresa May last year to negotiate after this divorce agreement has been reached with the European Union, and that he can get a better future relationship with the European Union. So they might be on board. But then Boris Johnson also needs the opposition Labour Party, or a few of them, to be on board. And we are hearing from them that they are now very much behind supporting a second referendum on this revised deal. They want to bring it back to the people, and they will not allow single Labour members of Parliament to vote in favour of Boris Johnson's deal. So it is really crunch time on Saturday in the British Parliament, and we will see if Boris Johnson's apparently good negotiating skills, now that he has reached a deal with the European Union, will also apply to the members of Parliament here in London.
Gerard, coming back to you in Brussels, this is a question that we heard that was posed by reporters just after Michel Barnier spoke there, asking, did you get any assurances from Boris Johnson, commitments that he does have a majority to pass this deal through his own parliament? Tell us more about what Michel Barnier said there.
That'll be really interesting to see, and I think Michel Barnier said, well, he is quite hopeful that Boris Johnson is confident that he will get a majority for such a deal, seeing all the effort he has put into this, and also seeing that he has made all these concessions regarding the backstop. And let's remind our viewer why this backstop solution, which is a safeguarding solution in case the EU and the UK in the future will not work out a closer relationship, a new relationship, that is something that still has to be found. Why that is so important, and it is so important because Boris Johnson also changed the political declaration. He only wants a loose trade deal with the European Union. So it is already clear that this backstop solution for Northern Ireland, this customs union regulatory scheme, will be needed if indeed the UK and the EU in the future will only have a loose but close free trade agreement between each other to regulate economic exchanges.
All right, Georg and Charlotte, we'll come back to you both and speak to you a little bit more about this news in a little bit. Thanks so much. Well, global stocks are surging on the news. So is the pound. Let's bring in market analyst Craig Erlam from Oanda in London. Hi, Craig. It does look like investors are excited.
Yeah, they're very excited. I think this deal that's been achieved today, while it doesn't guarantee it's going to get through Parliament on Saturday, it certainly does obviously bridge the divide that has existed for so long between London and Brussels. The question is now, what are the finer details? How much of an issue is this going to be for the DUP? Are other MPs going to be able to get on board, or are we going to have an extension and an election in order for that to happen? But even then, it's probably not the end of the world, because if we do get an extension and an election, there's a good chance that Boris Johnson then does get the numbers in Parliament to pass it later on in the year.
So do investors have the feeling we're coming to the end of the saga?
They do, but I mean, investors are eternal optimists. We've seen it so many times before that we've become very excited about the prospects for improvements, whether it's on Brexit, the trade deals or anything else, only to be sold short. So it's still early days. I feel like there's still a few more twists and turns to come starting this Saturday, but I think it's going to be exciting, and I think there's going to be an overall sense of relief now that we are eventually moving towards an agreement, towards a deal, and towards talking about something else.
Well, you mentioned some of the hesitancy because Boris Johnson described this deal as great, but there are questions about his ability to sell it back home. So what do you think his chances are?
I think it's going to be really difficult to get the numbers through. If we look at the state of Parliament right now, we've got 10 DUP MPs who have suggested they're going to oppose the deal. We have Labour who are going to whip their MPs to only back a deal with a second referendum. Of course, there probably will be some rogues there who will back the deal, who are MPs for heavily Leave constituencies. I don't imagine the Lib Dems or the SNP are going to back the deal either. So the numbers are going to be extremely tight. But like I say, if worst case scenario this deal doesn't get through Parliament, I don't think that's the end of the world for the deal, like it was with Theresa May's, because I think if this then goes to an election, Boris Johnson is in a very strong position, having negotiated a deal that keeps the UK out of a backstop, or the vast majority of the UK, I should say.
All right, Craig Erlam from Oanda in London. Thank you for that insight. Let's go back to our correspondents, Georg Mattis in Brussels and Charlotte Potts there in London. Good to see you both again. Georg, let's start with you there in Brussels. You know, this is seen, as you said, as a success. A lot of relief, I can imagine, there in Brussels. What are some of the reactions you're hearing from the various member states and from officials there in Brussels?
Oh, without doubt, you know, from the negotiators working 3 nights in a row, working for weeks and months on end on this compromise. And I've heard many negotiators tell me in those past 2 years that they actually genuinely believe they've made a good deal, they've made a good compromise that both the EU and the UK can live with, something that would leave things, create an orderly Brexit. And so clearly relief on their part that now we're looking at a situation that is much less worse than a disorderly Brexit. It's still bad news for the EU. They never wanted this. They still believe, and that is true for all member states, including the European Commission, the institutions here, it is a lose-lose situation. They'd be better off with the UK as part of the EU, but it is minimizing the damage.
The question, Georg, was asked of Michel Barnier, can the member states actually ratify this agreement during this summit that starts today? Is that possible?
Well, he said, and he's quite correct here, that we have to look at the terminology. What they will do is they endorse basically that deal that is now on the table, and it's the devil is in the details. So they will really look at the small print of that legal text that will be put in front of all the 27 leaders. And then what happens next is everyone will look at London on Saturday. And let's presume there is approval in London, then that document, that revised withdrawal agreement, would go to the European Parliament. And if the European Parliament also gives the green light, then it will get formal consent from the European Council.
All right, well, let's not presume anything. As we know, we don't know what will happen in London. Charlotte, we've seen the leader of the UK House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, saying this is a fundamentally different deal because the undemocratic backstop is gone. That's just what he's been saying in the last few minutes. What does that tell us about what kind of support Boris Johnson might be able to expect?
Well, this statement from Jacob Rees-Mogg that mirrors what we've been hearing out of Downing Street. That is what Downing Street has been selling. A spokeswoman just there sent this statement. It protects the union, removes the backstop, deals with unique circumstances on the island of Ireland, and allows the UK to leave the EU in time by October 31st. And this is the line that Boris Johnson will be taking now in convincing the members of Parliament and rally them around this deal. So we've been talking about this during the show, but this deal that Theresa May had negotiated was rejected by Parliament 3 times. And now Boris Johnson really has some serious convincing to do. It seems like Jacob Rees-Mogg, the hardliner of the Tory party, it seems like that Boris Johnson was able to rally those hardliners around him. They just trust him more as Prime Minister, trust also that he can negotiate a better future relationship with the European Union. We've been talking about that free trade deal that's now been written into the political declaration. So they trust him more going forward, and that is why he might have a lot more votes on in the Conservative Party on his side on Super Saturday, when Parliament is then finally voting again on this withdrawal agreement.
OK, so Charlotte, it seems he has more support among the Conservatives. But in terms of what he actually has in his hands in terms of this deal, and I know it's a very quick read of 64 pages of important and complex details there, but what does he have in his hands that Theresa May did not?
Well, he has removed this backstop that was the real sticking point in the withdrawal agreement from Theresa May, that insurance policy to avoid the hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And he's found ways around it, very technical terms, a way that Northern Ireland will stay in the UK customs regulatory zone and just a few checks in the Irish Sea and so on. So this is very much different from what Theresa May had negotiated, and that is why the hardliners might rally around it. But we've also heard from the Northern Irish DUP that they are still not happy with what's been negotiated, and we need to look at the details why they are not happy. They haven't said that in their statement, but they said so far they are not on board, and that is 10 votes less for Boris Johnson on Saturday if they stick to their guns.
All right, it's all in the numbers there. Charlotte Potts there for us in London and Georg Mattes in Brussels. Thank you both.